Honourable the Treasurer.
Deputy Speaker, this is this sort of noisy, abusive speech we hear from the honourable member.
Never hear that from you.
And I don't mind being abused because I can dish a bit of it back. But abusing public servants has become the cowardly stock in trade. The cowardly stock in trade of the member for Wentworth, abusing public servants. Coming into the House, spraying abuse around. I mean, an old friend of mine said, "Never worry about the skyrockets in politics. First a shower of sparks and a dead stick falls to earth." Well, there's a dead stick. There's a dead stick over there. And we're seeing the last of his sparks in another noisy, bellicose, empty speech. He says there are lots of questions to be answered, but he couldn't get a question up at question time, and he couldn't get one up in any one day of the last 2 weeks of sittings. There are lots of questions to be answered, but he can't ever think of one on question time, the period of question time. And he expects under the cover of a matter of public importance, having not asked me a question about the economy, all these matters of high moment, he suggests for me to come in and say, "Oh, you have questions, do you? Oh, yes, you know, get them all down." Well, pal, you're lucky I'm here to answer your case at all on the way, the contempt you treat the parliament, on not asking questions of the government on economic policy. Now, you start off by saying he says that he's always turning things around. Well, the one thing we've turned around is investment. And in those Treasury Statement 2, you should have winced at that components of GDP chart where it said the blocks of 5-year blocks of investment. In the 5 years under Labor to 1988, investment running at an annual rate of 10.8% real. In the 5 years to 83, 1.6. I mean, it's not even relative to it. I mean, it's not even within close proximity. 10.8 on average, 1.6 for the previous 5 years. The 5 years before that, 2.3. The 5 years to 1978 was 2.6. So in the 15 years to 1983, we've had investment in this country running at an average rate of 2.2%. As I've said in the post-budget debate, if you actually take the investment in the coal phase to Japan out of that, we had no investment in Australia for 15 years. That's where the current account came from. And in those last 5 critical years, the member for Wentworth was the principal advisor to the then Treasurer. And he's saying, that's me, he's always turning something around. Well, the fact is we have turned investment around, and it's been only a Labor government which could reignite the torch of investment in this country. And here we are, the pinstripe suit brigade, the so-called representatives of the managers. You couldn't do anything. You had to sit there and watch the capital stock fall to bits. You couldn't arrest a decline in our capital stock. You couldn't get investment. There was so little confidence in you by the business community. You could do no better than a 2.2% rate of investment, even with the Japanese building mines like they were going out of style. And that had nothing to do with Australian economic policy. So the fact is, pal, as you say, I am turning things around. Australia, by investment. Now, he gets up talking about the deals the government's making. He alleges that we're spending $200 million on the airlines. In fact, I think the cost at the moment looks like about $20 million. I mean, it's a very small cost of this year's budget. To do what? To keep the Australian airline system flying, to keep the Australian airline system working, so that planes could get in the air with ground staff and refuellers. Because if the ground staff and the refuellers had have been put off, the Australian Federation of Air Pilots would have been nearer to a de facto win. And basically that's because you've stood always for the pilots. You've stood right the way through this dispute for the pilots. And your great industrial relations policy, we've had little piety himself, Fred Chaney, supposed to have the policy. And where has he been? It's been David Joel who's been fronting for you for 3 weeks. Poor old David Joel. Talk about back from the dead. We haven't heard of him for years. He's been dredged out, put on the Qantas cap and uniform, the pilot's uniform, joystick in hand, he's out there defending coalition policy. And where's the industrial relations spokesman? Well, of course, the going's got too rough. When it really mattered, he evaporated. He's now rejoined the radio programs when he thinks the dispute has settled into a sort of concrete position so he can criticise the government. But when the dispute was at a point where it was fluid, where was he? He evaporated because basically your policy is to cave in. It's always been the same policy. You believe in industrial appeasement. That's your policy. And you think a tight monetary policy will lock up Australia's employers and they will then comply with the objective of government economic policy against any rapacious wage claim, when in fact this has never been the case and will never be the case. And the employers gave you the thumbs down when the survey, the BRW survey this week, when they said 21% of them supported your industrial relations policy. So, I mean, here you are. You don't have a policy on the key variable in the economy, wages. As I've said in this parliament on a number of occasions, if you can't run wages in Australia, you can't run Australia. You can't, and that's why you won't be given the chance. And then, here he is, the world champion conveyancer, telling us we've got the worst industrial relations policy in the OECD. We've had a bigger decline in unit labour costs than in any OECD country since 1983. Fact. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've got then this claim about the Reserve Bank, this terrible deal we did with the banks. That is, we developed an even flatter playing field between banks and non-banks and a better basis in regulation of banks. And instead of that appealing to the Shadow Treasurer, he says it's a smelly deal. But his colleague, the Shadow Finance Minister, Senator Stone, said he endorsed it, saying, "Of course we wouldn't scrap yesterday's decision because, as you yourself pointed out," that's the interviewer, "it does take the regime in relation to these non-callable deposits somewhat closer to a market regime." Well, of course he endorsed it because he was a bit thoughtful about it. He understood what it was. The member for Wentworth understands what it is too. But being basically in the political grafting business these days, he hasn't got the decency to say so. And the result is, how could he support a system where we removed the old statutory reserve deposits, his instrument, it put in place thereof, which was distorting savings banks and trading banks, because trading banks would not accept deposits while they had to leave 5% of them with the Reserve Bank, so they ran their book through the savings bank, or off-book or abroad, but not on-book. How could you support the retention of the SRDs when we moved to these non-callable deposits on a broad basis of liabilities, where we had a penalty of 5%, that is, when we instituted them, a T-note rate of around 10% against an interest rate we were paying of 5%, leaving a penalty of 5%. To find that penalty had become 13% as short-term interest rates had provided the Reserve Bank with a windfall as short-term interest rate went to 18%. So instead of having a 5% penalty, we had 18%. And we've now got a formula, which is a market-related one, T-notes minus 5%, which restores that penalty to 5%, gives a better basis for regulation of banks, and the extra revenue, the diminished revenue which the banks would be paying the central bank, can be devoted to what would have otherwise been a higher cost to borrowers in housing. And why is it in housing? Because the margins in housing were cut down compared to margins in commercial lending, and that's why the banks devoted the proceeds of that to housing. But, of course, what the opposition was hoping is that housing interest rates would move to 18%. That's what they were hoping. That's what they would have been hoping last week, saying, "Oh, look, here we are, here's a chance. We think the banks are going to jack the rates to 18%, and that'll do the government a bit of damage." But as usual, you fell on your faces. You fell on your faces as usual. And what we came up with is, again, another bit of financial innovation, which is about improving the relationship between banks and non-banks and flattening the playing field. You talk about building societies and state banks. They don't pay these penalties. They don't pay these. They don't make these deposits. So therefore, they're not wearing this burden, and therefore they could enjoy no benefit from the change. And with building societies, they haven't got between 25% and 33% of their book at regulated rates of housing for lending at 13.5%. All of their book is unregulated. All of their loans are profitable. Not just 3/4 of their loans or 60% of their loans, but all of their loans are profitable. And that's why there can be no question about building societies and state banks needing to be involved in such an arrangement. But again, that was endorsed by the Shadow Finance Minister, who said, yes, this brings the arrangement somewhat closer to a market regime. It's a more sensible prudential structure. But instead of hailing that and saying, well, that's good, that's a sensible change, it's a market-related price, it's a flatter field between banks and non-banks, and it also means that rates don't have to go to 18%. What you lot are about are rates as high as you could get them. That's what you're about. That's what you're about. You're basically about pumping interest rates up. But then you have the member for Wentworth has the gall, again, he's back to his usual game of the last year or two, attacking the Governor of the Reserve Bank. And he's saying, my mate Bernie, that's the word you do. My mate Bernie, this is the word, you should be ashamed to say that. You should be ashamed to say it. Ashamed to say it. Unprecedented behaviour. That is, a central bank governor talking about non-callable deposits with the constituent banks should not be involved in the decision. That's what you're saying. It was unprecedented for him to be there, you said. I mean, you ought to be just ashamed of you. You know what you are? You're a lout, using that kind of language in Parliament about somebody who's in the bureaucracy of this country. You saw what the former governor had to say when he left office. Let me just read what he had to say. Throughout more than 6 years in office, this government has been very correct in its dealings with the bank. Very correct. Let me repeat the words. Very correct in its dealings with the bank. Relations personally have been harmonious and very fruitful. There has been no interference in matters that are the responsibility of the bank. And this counters the charge, the mealy-mouthed charge thrown around by you over years about interference by the government in monetary policy. That is deceitful interference. And he goes on to say that there have been no interference in matters of the responsibility of the bank. But here's the killer punchline. Only an insider can know that this has not always been so. Only an insider can know that has not always been so. Now, in the language of bureaucracies, it's like a big neon sign. Only an insider can know that there's not always been so. In other words, he was talking about you. He was talking about the way you used to beat the Reserve Bank around the head when you were advising Treasurer Howard, and Treasurer Howard up there trying to interfere with RBA policy all the time for your own political purposes. And yet you've got the temerity, and of course this is your yardstick. You know what you're always up to. You're always in there trying to distort bank decisions, and because you were, you think we were. But the fact is we were not. We treated this institution with respect, and it's got a proper position, which I enunciated in a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, in a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald, the balance between the government's powers, its proper powers as the elected government, and the responsibility to the Reserve Bank. But this notion you're now putting that we hide behind some central bank is, of course, nonsense. Mr Deputy Speaker, the whole matter of public importance is just a sham. What he's after is higher interest rates. He hasn't got the ghost of a policy about anything. He can't put a question up at question time. He attacks bureaucrats under the cover and privilege of Parliament. He's a parliamentary coward who's got little decency but no policy to match any of the words he puts here in the Parliament.